Hey, what's up you guys? My name is Amber, welcome to my channel, and today I'm going to be reviewing the book Hunter's Moon by VJ Garland. As a brief disclaimer, this video is not monetarily sponsored in any way. However, I did receive an advanced copy of the book in order to review and feature on my social channels. And while this is not like anything to do with the content of the story itself, I do just want to mention and commend the physical design of the book. Just like the size, the shape, the texture of the cover, quite delightful. And the cover of the book, I mean, come on. Absolutely stunning. It does kind of lead you to believe that the book is going to be more horror based than it actually ends up being, and I would have preferred it to have been a little bit more horror based like the cover suggests, but we'll get to all that in just a minute. Before we get too far into the review, I did want to mention a few content and potential trigger warnings just in case. The book does involve graphic depictions of killing, crude sexual language, descriptions of abuse, stigmatized talk about STDs, fatphobic adjectives, slut-shaming adjectives, vague homophobia, a few sex scenes, and some food talk and body depictions that could be potentially triggering for those with eating disorders. The book is primarily told from two points of view, that of Noah and Lupina, with a few additional chapters told from Jax, Jerry, Corey, and Penny. So within the story, we have Noah, having been a desperately bloodthirsty werewolf for about 5 years, finally leaves his wife Lupina, who had stayed by his side throughout the change, but just barely, as they never spoke anymore. They essentially didn't have any kind of relationship, and what they did have was strictly business. She would lure in his victims in order to protect herself. After leaving, Noah finds himself on the road working with this old trucker dude who finds out about Noah's history of being a werewolf and asks to be changed himself. Noah makes the mistake of obliging. Now, Jerry, the new turn, starts turning other people and expanding their pack as they travel across the states, but it causes a lot of tension between Jerry and Noah because Noah disagrees with a lot of how and what Jerry is doing, and there's just this power dynamic discrepancy as they disagree with how things should be handled. In the meantime, Lupe rebuilds a life for herself in a small fishing town where she befriends a neighbor who gives her some much needed friendship and support as she comes back from these years of terror. But all of that is threatened when Noah's pack's bloody trail finds itself nearing where Lupe now resides. Now, as for my thoughts on the book itself, and this is coming as a review, having read the book twice. I was initially supposed to get the physical copy of the ARC, but there were some delays with the production, so I ended up getting a digital copy of the ARC. So I read the digital version and had my initial notes written, but once I did receive the physical copy, I did want to just give it another pass through just to make sure there wasn't any difference between the two versions, because generally a physical ARC tends to be a little bit more finalized than a digital ARC tends to be. Now, in this particular case, there ended up not really being any discrepancies between the two versions. So I pretty much just read the same story twice, but that gives me a little bit extra insight and authority to be able to discuss the contents. And that being said, upon reading it a second time, I had the thought cross my mind that there did have the potential of the book being a satire. Now, since I am not the author, I cannot officially confirm or deny, so I am not sure if the intent was for it to be a satire, but I did have an improved reading experience reading it as a satire on toxic masculinity. Again, whether or not that was the intent, I truly have no idea, but it makes it a little bit easier to get through considering some of the content that it has, which of course we will discuss. Conceptually, the plot is there and the ideas behind the book I really liked. I thought it was a new take on the werewolf genre where it's not really glorified or seen as this like fun, cool thing. Like, they do show a lot of the horrors behind it, and the book does have a lot of like graphic depictions of gore and killing that definitely made it have a lot of horror elements, which is something that I am a huge fan of and really liked the idea of the potential. but it didn't quite fully take the route of horror as much as I would have personally preferred. I do think that the story could have used a lot more development, especially when it came to the time blocking of the book. I thought that just like the choice in time jumps and blocking was a little bit odd, and we definitely could have stood to have seen the book been fluffed out and filled in a little bit more, get some more descriptions of what exactly is happening during those time jumps, and just develop the overall plot and story a little bit more than it was. And I definitely think that that would have benefited and just given it a little bit more substance, especially when it came to different relationships that were had within the book. For example, we have the character Lupina, and the neighbor that she befriends within the book is named Jax. And like straight off the bat, Jax is just very presumptuous and cocky and kind of just inserts himself straight into things. And I think we could have taken a step back and had that develop a little bit more and shown a little bit more of that development instead of just like literally 0 to 100 within a page. Where they're like immediately friends because Jack just like inserts himself into her life, and that could have stood to have developed a little bit more, and I would have loved to have seen a bit more of their developments just overall throughout the book, because Lupina's chapters and their storyline read very much like kind of like an edgy Lifetime style movie was definitely the vibe that it gave off. And then when it came to Noah, I also think we could have just gotten a little bit more fluff when it came to his relationships and interactions with other people, especially when it comes to the other members of his pack. I think what it really comes down to is we're told more things than we're shown. You know, we're told that there's tensions rising between him and Jerry when it comes to how this pack and the whole werewolf ordeal is treated, and we're told that, you know, Noah has this better relationship with one of the newer pack members, and we just don't get to see a lot of it. Like, we definitely see some of it, so I'm not gonna say that they exclusively tell and not show, but I do think, like, but I definitely would have liked to have seen a little bit more, because we definitely had the time to do so. I mean, it's not a particularly long book, so it definitely could have stood to have extended its time a little bit more. And two, when it comes to Noah's chapters, it vaguely reads kind of like American Psycho, but like not a very meticulously crafted classic. Just with some of the, you know, crude and graphic descriptions and explanations of things, and just how I'm choosing to interpret it as satire. Again, not sure if it's intentional, but it's what I'm gonna go with. Just on toxic masculinity and trucker culture, and just how kind of gross guys can be in that culture and sense. Especially when it comes to the language talking about women within the book, within Noah's chapters at least. There's just a lot of very crude and sexual language, and we get, you know, some fat phobic adjectives and a lot of slut shaming, which is just very, very unnecessary, especially when it's exactly the type of thing that they were seeking out. So it's like, why are you criticizing the very thing that you wanted? Why you like this, you know? That's not to say that it's entirely unrealistic, because that is, you know, a very, very true and realistic depiction of a lot of people, more particularly guys who have not learned to shed their toxic masculinity traits. So I'm not going to go ahead and be like, oh, that's completely unrealistic. It was just a little bit uncomfortable and icky to read. And there's also a character featured who has an STD, and the way that they talk about that just feels very gross and stigmatized. And I think they were like, I think the intent was to show just like how particularly gross this one character was, but there are definitely less offensive and damaging ways to depict that. So, And there are a few queer characters featured within the book. One is verified as being a bisexual man, and then there are at least 2 other queer males who are involved in a sexual relationship with each other. We don't get specific identities or labels, but the way that they're referenced and the way other characters refer to them and just how the topic is broached does feel vaguely homophobic and uncomfortable at times. Not in every sense of them being mentioned, but in certain scenarios. Like, it just reads a little bit homophobic, and I can't tell if that was coming... It's just with most of my criticisms overall of the book and certain plot devices, it's very hard to tell if it's coming from the author themselves or if it's just supposed to be coming from these specific characters and exemplifying how these characters are. Again, like I said, I'm choosing to read it as a satire, so I definitely hope that this isn't how the author views certain groups of people. I'm going to assume not, because if I'm not mistaken, the author is actually a woman. So, you know, I definitely hope that she doesn't have these kind of like awful opinions of women and other characters. I do think that it is just trying to exemplify the culture of toxic masculinity and that scenario, but it does make it a little bit uncomfortable to read. It's definitely, you know, not so much that it completely deters me from reading it. I mean, obviously, I read the entire book twice. You know, I wouldn't have done that if I were so incredibly uncomfortable or anything like that. I just do think that we could have stood to have seen a few more characters that were just a little bit more wholesome to show the juxtaposition between the two, especially on Lupe's side of things. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more from the perspective of Lupina and Jax and that storyline versus... Well, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more coming from both sides, but particularly Lupina's side. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of her personal growth and development, because that would have especially made the last chapter more impactful. The last chapter is written and the finale of the book is meant to be very emotionally charged and very shocking. I mean, I was definitely surprised by the ending, but it would have just hit a lot harder had we gotten to see a bit more development. And particularly in that last chapter, it was written in a way where I was slightly confused as to what exactly was going on, whereas the rest of the book had not been like that to that extent. So I would have liked to have seen just like a re-edit of that last chapter particularly, so the emotional reveal was able to drive home a little bit more. Speaking of it just feeling a little bit unfinished, just overall that's kind of the vibe that the book gets. And that being said, I did read an advanced copy, so I cannot personally 100% verify how different the advanced copy is going to be from the final publicized version. But in my case, it just felt slightly unfinished, like it was more of a draft than a final publication. The plot could have been extended a little bit more, and there were just quite a few grammatical errors in the sense of like misplaced commas, lack or unnecessary capitalization, things like that. That would have been fine with just another pass through of editing. And again, that could absolutely be exclusive to the ARC version. So ideally, you know, the final version will have had another pass through at editing and you won't notice those problems like I did. But again, you know, overall, I thought that the concept was there. The concept was great. It just could have been delivered a little bit better, but I would definitely be curious to see, you know, more work from this author in the future after this book, you know, having, you know, grown and developed a little bit more. And I would definitely not mind a similar storyline happening, but just having it lean a lot more into the horror and gore aspects, I think could potentially be really, really fun for people who are interested in the horror genre, and that this particular author would be really good at writing, because the depictions of gore and, you know, the horror aspects in that sense were pretty well written. Like, you were able to get a very, very clear visual of what exactly it meant, and just the horrifying, gross visuals. Gross complimentary, because, like, it's meant to be, because, like, graphic werewolves, things like that. I would have liked to have seen the rest of the book on that same level of just easy to visualize. Some aspects were, some weren't, you know, it was very hit or miss. And the opinion of the book is very much dependent on how you choose to interpret the book. Like I said, it is much, much easier to read if you are looking into it as a satire and some over-exaggeration, or just the observation into the particular toxic masculine culture. But if you are reading it just straight as is, I would completely understand being uncomfortable with a lot of the depictions and topics brought up. But with that all being said, I would like to say a huge thank you to VJ Garland for sending me this copy in order to review, and a huge thank you to you guys for watching. I had a blast hanging out with y'all. Peace.